So moving into our last chapter for the circulatory system, we're now going to get into the blood vessels. We're going to break this actually into 3 videos rather than just 2 like normal. So we'll cover the blood vessel overview for this one, and then for the next ones we'll break it into 2 parts because it's just so much in one section. So what do we want to cover in this chapter? We're going to talk about the structure of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. We'll talk about blood flow, pressure, and resistance, and the relationship between those. We'll talk about how the cardiovascular system interacts with other body systems and the major blood vessels we find in the pulmonary and systemic circulations. We're going to dive in and get a little closer with the hepatic portal system specifically, and then we'll also look at the development of blood vessels and fetal circulation, and how that circulation changes from a fetus to an infant after birth. So what do we want to be able to accomplish in this particular video? So we're just going to do the overview of the blood vessels for this video. We're going to talk about the structure of blood vessels and like the tunics or the layers. We'll talk about some of the differences between different types of arteries based on their location, function, and structure. Same thing with capillaries. We'll talk about the capillary bed, and then we'll also get into veins, venules, and venous sinuses as well. So let's talk about the pulmonary and systemic circuits. So we've mentioned these concepts before, talking about pulmonary circuit versus systemic circuit, and that, but we were talking about it in reference to the heart, right? That the pulmonary circuit is serviced by the right side of the heart, and the systemic circuit is serviced by the left side of the heart. But then we didn't really go anywhere past that. So if we look what's going on, right? The right side of the heart will pump into the lungs, right, for the pulmonary circuit. We have capillary beds within the lungs, and we see that go from blue to purple, meaning we're getting oxygenated. And by the time we return back to the heart through a pulmonary vein, we are nice and oxygenated. Again, remember, the color tells you about the oxygenation of the blood found in that blood vessel. It does not name the blood vessel. Remember our definitions for artery and vein. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood back towards the heart. Coloration, although there is somewhat of a pattern, coloration does not define artery and vein. I'm saying that over and over again because I always see people mix this up, and I want to drive that point home. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood towards the heart. Oxygenation is not part of that definition, because the pulmonary circuit, like we're looking at here at the top, our pulmonary artery is blue and our pulmonary vein is red. So the coloration here obviously is not what you would have expected if you were thinking in a coloring system, coloring naming system for arteries and veins. Moving down from the left side of the heart, we go through the aorta. The aorta is actually huge. It's not just coming from the heart, it's actually going to descend down through the abdominal cavity. And we have branches that come off to service the upper body. We have the hepatic artery that's going to go to the liver. Moving down, the renal artery to service the kidneys, right? Arteries to service the stomach and intestines and the lower body. And then on the vein side, we have the renal vein, which is coming from the kidney back to the heart. The hepatic vein, which is coming from the liver back to the heart. Same with the upper body. And then we have this one here in the middle that I want to point out because we're going to talk about this one significantly, and that's the hepatic portal vein. So the hepatic portal vein is going to come from the stomach and the intestines and pass through the liver before going back up to the heart, right? Think like puertas, like a door, right, or a gateway, right? This is going to be like that door, the gateway from the digestive system to the liver. So let's go ahead and compare arteries and veins together too. So arteries and veins have, they're similar in their basic structure in that we have these basic spaces. So I'm going to start from the inside and work our way out. But in the very inside, we have what's called the lumen. That's the open space, right? So the white space you see here is the lumen, because that's where the blood is going to be taking up, right? It's not a physical structure, it's the open space we see. Then the next layer, the actual first layer we see inside the artery is the tunica intima, right? Like intimate, right? You're close, so you're inside. Tunica media, and then tunica externa. You may also see the tunica externa called the tunica adventitia. Either is fine. I will probably just use tunica externa since that is a much more clear term for you guys, and it's what your textbook uses. If we look at what we find in each of these, right, we see that the tunica intima is made up of endothelium, right, an elastic membrane. So we have like a thin component to the inside of an artery. We get to the tunica media, we see this is going to be that smooth muscle. So we have a muscle layer, and there's some elastic fibers that run through that, but we have smooth muscle. And then the tunica externa is going to be like this more like fibrous component. And that's going to have like the vas vassorium, nervivasorium. So we're looking at like little tiny blood vessels, little tiny nerves that are going to come through on the tunica externa. Right, we do see a little bit of smooth muscle in the external, but not a whole lot. Generally, if we're thinking smooth muscle, we're thinking tunica media. Right. We notice though we have a very thick muscle layer in the artery. When we look at the vein, one, we don't have that internal elastic membrane, right? We are just endothelium. The muscle layer is much more narrow, much thinner. And then even the tunica externa is a little bit thinner with a little bit of muscle too. But this is what we would look like right in the picture, and then down below is what we look like in real life. And you can see like very round, very thick muscle layer in that artery compared to the vein, right? The vein, the main thing you notice with the vein is the tunica externa, right? That's the thing you really notice. Versus in the artery, the muscle, the tunica media is like really what stands out. So if we look at the general, this is just comparing the tunics, right? Tunica intima, tunica media, tunica externa. And again, I know your labs use some terms, or you may see some other terms if you use other resources. I will use these terms here, the tunica intima, media, and externa, just because I think the names are much more self-explanatory than some of the other ones. Like I said, you may see like tunica adventitia for the externa. I will just use externa. I'm not going to read through all this because a lot of this is what we talked about on this slide before, but if you would like to pause here and take a peek, then you can. Otherwise, I will just move forward. Now, when we look at arteries, we can break arteries down into different categories themselves. Elastic arteries, muscular arteries, and arterioles. Arterioles are going to be like the small arteries that join the bigger arteries and the capillaries. And they actually have a pretty important role in terms of like helping you control things like blood pressure. So even though they're small, they are mighty. But let's go ahead and start on the left and work our way over from the elastic artery, which we see that tunica intima has more like fibers running through it. The tunica media, and then the tunica externa is a bit thin, right? So have that going there. Muscular, we don't see those fibers so much in the tunica intima, and the tunica externa is much thicker. And then the arteriole is much smaller, right? That tunica externa is almost non-existent. Tunica intima is very thin, and even the muscle, like we're only seeing a few cells. So that tells you the size, right? Arterioles are really small compared to both the elastic and the muscular arteries. So something that can develop in your arteries is a condition called atherosclerosis. This is when we see a buildup of plaque inside that inner wall, like kind of between the intima and media. And this is going to change how blood flows through that artery. There's a lot of things that can cause it. It's a family history, basically, so there could be genetic components involved. If you have poor lifestyle choices like an unhealthy diet, if you have diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, if you're sedentary, you're not exercising much, obesity, smoking. I mean, there's a laundry list of things that can increase your risk of developing this. And there are complications that can come from this, right? So someone can end up with coronary artery disease. So this is going to cause like chest pain. It could cause a heart attack. It could cause your heart to fail. Carotid artery disease. This is when the arteries going to your brain are narrowed by this, and that can cause like a stroke. It could cause peripheral artery disease. This is where like basically you are not getting blood flow to like your arms and legs. This can increase your like this is going to decrease sensitivity since like those components are like not getting what they need. In worst case scenarios, it can actually start to cause tissue death because they're lacking supplies from blood vessels so much. Aneurysms, right? This can cause an aneurysm, which is like a swelling or a bursting of a blood vessel that can cause bleeding on the inside. And in many cases, like this is life threatening if like especially if it bursts, like that's an emergency. And then chronic kidney disease, like if it's leading to the kidneys, right? The kidneys are not getting their oxygen-rich blood, and so they're not able to filter waste products properly. They're not able to remove excessive fluids, and so that can cause problems with the kidneys too. So it's something that really needs to be taken seriously. The hard part with this is a lot of times you don't notice until you're having all these other problems. And so something to like take care of in terms of limiting your risk factors, which means if you smoke, don't smoke. Eat a really good diet as best you can, getting as much exercise as you can on a regular basis, and you don't got to go crazy, but even going for a walk is better than sitting. Maintain your healthy weight, so if you're overweight or obese, doing what you can to try to lose some of that weight, and then making sure your blood pressure is fine. Again, blood pressure is something that like you don't feel like high blood pressure necessarily unless it's like really bad. And so it's super important to be getting regular checkups to know where your blood pressure stands. And same thing with your blood sugar levels, your cholesterol. Those are things that, again, you don't notice right away. You don't feel like a symptom from those. It's something that you have to get. It's better to get it checked up on and like blood work that you get done annually. Moving on to capillaries. So capillaries are these really small, really thin blood vessels. I like to call them the drive-throughs of the vascular system. The reason being is that the speed, the velocity of blood slows down significantly in the capillaries. Because the whole point of capillaries is to do exchange. It's to exchange nutrients and waste, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So I like to say like capillaries are like a drive-through because just like a drive-through, you slow down when you drive through one, right? Nobody's going through the Starbucks drive-through at 55 miles an hour, or at least I hope not. And you're doing an exchange, right? You're giving money, you get a latte, right? So I think of the capillaries like that. I think it's a helpful way to think of them. They have this very basic, very simple setup. They have the endothelial layer, which is the tunica intima, and then a basement membrane. And that's it. They're one cell thick. They're super, super small, right? We're on the microscopic level here. And that's because it's a lot easier to diffuse things through a very thin layer, like one cell, than it is to have, like, if we looked at the arteries, right, they have a thick, that thick muscle layer, and then you have, like, the tunica externa on the outside, and you have the tunica intima on the inside. Like, that's a lot to get through. Capillaries, we need to do those exchanges as efficiently as possible, so being really thin, having as little tissue as possible is really beneficial. The continuous capillaries are what we usually think of as probably what you've learned if you've taken a class like this before. You've probably learned about continuous capillaries. These are ones that are just kind of found in general, like in your muscle and all that kind of stuff. And then in certain organs, we have modified the capillaries to become fenestrated. They have fenestration, which are like these holes, right, these pores. This is going to be in some areas where we want to do, maybe we need a little bit more leakiness. So, for example, in the kidneys are going to help filter waste from the blood, and so having them get better access to things in the blood, right, where more of it can kind of, quote, leak out, is very beneficial. So a lot of glands will have fenestrated, especially like if we think of kidney, right, where we are doing a filtering process. And then sinusoid, we see like big gaps, right, big holes. Even the basement membrane's not even complete. And this is where we need like a lot of leakiness. So like your spleen, right, lymph nodes, those are going to be like this, the sinusoid, because we really do want some of that blood to kind of leak out to go through a process. We're not going to get into what those processes are in this class. You'll go into that in physiology. You'll talk about, how do kidneys filter out waste. You'll talk about how like spleens work and all that. So we're not going to worry about like what the details. Just know that you'll see these come back and that they do have a purpose. This is not like diseased. If we look at the structure of where capillaries come into play, we have the arteries, which are off to the side here, right? They're way over here, which are going to feed into arterioles, the little teeny tiny arteries. We have the precapillary sphincter and the meta-arteriole. This is going to serve as like a shunt, like a vascular shunt, right, when the sphincters close. So we can just go, right, when all these little sphincters close. These are these little muscle sphincters. We can close that off. The meta-arteriole kind of goes through, right, if these shunts are closed. So blood has a place to go. We also have the arteriovenous anastomosis, which is going to link together without that capillary bed. Here in beige, we have the capillaries. See how they're all intertwined? So each individual one is a capillary. All together, we call it a capillary bed, right? Because it's like, it almost looks like a little hammock, right? Then we connect through and we get to the venule, right? And the venule will feed into a vein. Now let's get into our veins. One big thing we notice is that muscle layer is much, much, much thinner, right? So our tunica externa is really making up the bulk of it, and then the tunica media and intima are both relatively thin. If we're looking at a large vein, we're looking at a medium vein, the same concept. The tunica externa is really the one that takes over. The venule is the one where everybody's thin, right? Because these guys are just super small. But one big thing that the veins have that the arteries do not are valves. So this is looking at it from like the top down. Here's looking at the valve from the side. This is to prevent the backflow of blood because the veins are not under as much pressure as the arteries. Arteries, the blood pressure is high. Veins, the blood pressure is lower. And so because of that, because the pressure isn't as high, we need something to keep blood from accidentally flowing backwards. The valves can help with that. So if we compare arteries and veins, and you should definitely take a peek at this, memorize this table, because this is going to help you a lot, especially if you have to identify them under like the microscope, or if I ask you questions on like a lecture exam. This table right here, know this table inside and out. The direction that blood flows, that's going to be basically our definition of artery and veins. The general appearance, round versus like irregular or collapse, that'll help you with looking at them under the microscope. The pressure, high versus low, that explains why we see some of the structures we see. Like, why are the walls very thick in the arteries? Because they're under high pressure, right? If the walls were thin, it'd be like trying to put like a fire hose through a paper tube, like a cardboard tube. Like that cardboard tube would be blown apart. But if you have like a super thick woven or like rubber tubing, you can put a higher pressure through that, right? Whereas the veins, their walls are thin, but they're under low pressure. The oxygen concentration, this is why we don't use this as our definition, because we see like in the systemic, oxygenation is higher, but in pulmonary it's lower. Veins is opposite, it's lower in systemic and higher in the pulmonary system. So again, relative oxygen concentration, aka color, is not the thing to use to define arteries and veins. And then valves, we don't see those in arteries, we do see them in many of the veins. So since we don't have a lot of pressure, what the heck is helping us get blood back up, right? Because we're having to fight against gravity if it's like down in the feet. We can use gravity to our advantage if we're talking about like the head, right, moving downward. There is a little bit of residual blood pressure we can use. The valves, which we've already talked about, right, that's one-way doors where blood can push through the valve, but if it moves back down, the valve snaps shut. And then we also have the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump. Now, I mentioned those way back, just very briefly before, and you may or may not have even caught it, but we're going to now talk about them in detail. I'm going to talk about the respiratory pump first and then the skeletal muscle pump because I don't have a picture for respiratory pump, but I do have pictures of the skeletal one. So let's get respiratory pump from this slide out of the way really fast. So the respiratory pump, this basically is using the changing of the pressure in your lungs, like when you breathe, it's using your breathing to help move blood through the veins. So basically what happens is when you breathe in, right, you think about what happens when you breathe in, your diaphragm moves down, your ribs move up and out, and it creates a bigger vault, like space in your chest. That's going to decrease the vault, like the pressure in there. So volume goes up, pressure goes down, and because there's low pressure in the chest compared to the abdominal region, it's going to almost create like a sucking effect. It's going to like a vacuum effect, like pull that blood upward, right? And as it moves upward, it gets basically trapped up there because of like valves and whatnot. And so then as you exhale, right, the pressure in the chest increases. We don't have blood getting sucked up, right? But every time you breathe in, right, you're helping create a suction effect, pulling that blood from like the abdominal region up into the thoracic cavity, up into the chest, right? So that's how the respiratory pump is working. And again, we're not going to get super detailed with that, but like that's the basics of how that's helping, right? You breathing is literally helping you pump your blood, as weird as that sounds. And then the skeletal muscle pump, that's where I do have my picture. So this is basically where like the muscles are relaxed, the valves are closed, right? Blood is trapped in between these two valves. But as the muscle contracts, right, that belly of the muscle gets very large, gets like fat, and it's going to squeeze on that vein. And when it squeezes, it's going to push blood up through that valve. Because remember, they can push up through the valve, it just can't come back the other way. So every time the muscles contract, right, that belly of the muscle gets fat, it puts pressure and squishes in on that vein, and it pushes blood up through the valve. Sometimes you can have like changes to the veins, like varicose veins. This is where there's a problem with blood flow, and it causes a physical change in the veins themselves. They're getting bigger, they're getting thicker, they're getting twisted or gnarled, and so they takes on this appearance. If we look at where we find blood, like basically like this is where we're looking at. Each circle is 100%, so like we have 100% here, right? And then this is like the breakdown of that 100%, and then this is the breakdown of that 100%, right, so to speak. So if we look at, most of our blood is in the systemic circulation, which makes sense, right? About 7% is in the heart at any given moment, 9% in the lung, like the pulmonary circuit, and then 84% is in the body. That's fine. When we look at what we find in the pulmonary circuit, it's split kind of evenly between the capillaries, arteries, and veins. It's almost even. The heart, that doesn't change, it's just in the heart. When we look at the systemic side, we look at the body, right? 7% of that is in your capillaries, 13% in your arteries, 64% is in your veins. So over half of your blood at any given moment is in a vein. That's kind of cool, right? When you think of it. So you can it's almost like most of your blood is like stored basically like in veins. It's like where you're gonna find it. So this is just taking that picture we saw on the last slide and putting it in a table format. So if you're looking at this picture here and you're like, this makes no sense to me, that's okay. This is just that broken down into a table format instead. So again, 84% is going to be in your body, 9% roughly in your lungs, 7% in your heart. And then when we look at the body, 64% of your blood will be found in the veins. That's a lot, right, of that 84. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot that we find there. So again, over half of your blood is in a vein at any moment.